I'm Somrat Niyogi, and I'm guest hosting a new series for the Village Global podcast called Recall Sessions. Everyone talks about product, but I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention: go-to-market. Specifically, how do the world's most successful companies get their first customers? I'll be sitting down with founders and operators of billion-dollar companies to hear the real story. Not the polished version where everything just clicked, the messy version, the cold emails, the first deals, the selling before the product was even ready. My guest today is Itai Damti, co-founder and CEO of Unit. Unit is the platform that lets companies offer accounts, cards, money movement, and capital under their own brand. They move over $50 billion annually, serve 2 million plus end users across 100 plus platforms, and power programs at 7 public companies, including Wix and WorldPay. This is Itai's second company with his co-founder, Doron Somek. They previously built Leverate together, which they bootstrapped to 160 employees and over $100 billion in monthly trading volume. They've been building fintech companies and working together for over 20 years. We're going back to the early days before Unit became Unit. All right. Itai, I've actually been wanting to do this for several years. There's not a lot of people that have started an embedded business. You guys have gotten to significant scale. You've been doing it the last few years, and as someone who talks to a lot of founders that are building embedded businesses, I think there's not many people in the world that have the type of experience that has gone through the journey of building an embedded business. And so I appreciate you giving us the opportunity and our listeners to hear about your story and some of the early days of how you built Unit. So thank you for taking the time.
Thanks for inviting me. Excited to be here and share.
So, maybe we can kind of start from the early days. Like, how did Unit kind of get started? I know you and Doron had a prior company. We'd love to hear to kind of set the stage of the history of Unit, and we're going to just jump right in and talk about how you built Unit and how you got your early customers.
Awesome. Yeah. So we started the company in 2019. We had known each other for about 15 years at the time. Actually, we built together for most of those years. For both Doron and me, this is our third company. The first one was a shared experience, a decade-long experience. We left the business in 2016. We both started second companies and failed independently, and then we got together in 2019 to start what became Unit. I'm an engineer by background. He was CTO at the first business. I wasn't smart enough to be the CTO or even to make a bid for that seat this time, so I took the worst job of a CEO. And what guided us, first of all, we had a 6-month ideation process that led to Unit being born, and we evaluated different ideas. We landed on this insight that when we look at financial services innovation, we kind of saw back then the Chimes and the Venmos and the lending clubs as what we thought about as FinTech 1.0, where those companies tried to build what the big banks and the incumbents had, and they tried to do it better, faster, and cheaper. So we thought that wave was coming to an end, or maybe that's not really what financial services are going to look like 10 and 20 years from that point. And then we saw something really interesting starting, which was the Shopifys and Ubers and Gastos and Toasts of the world expanding from their core businesses of software onto more forms of financial services. It could be cards, it could be accounts, it could be capital products, it could be different forms of money movement. And we decided that, that wave had a much bigger right to win than the first wave of fintech. Of course, all of us know Venmo and Lending Club, but not many of these companies have actually become glorious businesses. But we looked at what Toast and Shopify represented in their segment, and we thought these companies really have what it takes to win in financial services, right? They have trust, they have data, they have the distribution, they have the software and the money flows, and all they need to do is to find ways to extend deeper into the financial life of their customers, being restaurants or e-commerce businesses. And so the right to win was there. We could clearly see how thousands of companies are going to make it in financial services. But the second thing we've noticed is that the old companies, the Chimes and the Venmos, built on pretty horrible infrastructure. Each one of them needed to invest a lot of money, make 10 to 20 buying decisions, and master a lot of concepts. And we thought that there's no chance that if 2,000 more companies were to offer financial services, they would actually have the resources and willingness to go through this. And we thought something simpler needed to exist. And so we launched Unit and kind of did it with the premise that we make it easier for software companies to become winners in financial services. We can talk more about the different primitives and the different approaches that we've taken, but that was the original premise.
And I know that embedded finance like already a kind of coined term, or I mean, what was the state of like the market of embedded fintech? I don't know if you guys were like at the early days or it was already kind of coined term.
Embedded finance wasn't really widely used. I think you saw a range from some people describing a myriad of infrastructure options, maybe card issuing as the center of gravity in financial services innovation. Marqeta was starting to take off, or taking off pretty significantly at the time. Then you had people using the term banking as a service, which we never liked for multiple reasons. And you also saw different practices within the ecosystem. Some companies had their own bank charters and licenses. Other companies focused on just one component, and you can make buying decisions and use it and make a lot of other buying decisions. And so there was no standard name for what our ecosystem was enabling. And when Stripe came out with this product, I remember in 2020, late 2020, they used banking as a service, and I was like, "What are you doing? Like, this is not the term that actually explains what's being built and what's possible." And so they kind of shifted the language towards banking as a service, but we continue to use exclusively embedded finance for years. And I think now the ecosystem is kind of shifting back to using embedded finance as the umbrella for all these different constructs and experiences.
And I mean, just to double click on there, like what was wrong with banking as a service? I mean, in some ways it's elegant in it sounds like what it was at that time. Like why were you against it?
I think banking represents something that we all kind of understand, but it's not really what's being built. So as an example, when Toast built Capital back then, or when Gusto launched wallets for employees, it wasn't always a banking product, right? It could be a loan product where you need to keep track of liabilities that a restaurant has towards you, and that's not really a banking concept. Or in the case of Gusto, it was more wallets and cards, but there was no obligation that the end user banks with the company. So we thought it was quite restrictive. We also thought it was a supply-centric term rather than demand and experience-centric. What's actually being enabled is embedded finance. It's financial services and financial experiences in context that are way better than what banking could be or what people could get otherwise. So banking as a service just felt reductive. It felt like it was related more to the supply than the demand. And later, as the ecosystem evolved, I think a lot of companies gave this specific bucket a bad rep. And I think it was overdue for a repackaging and rethinking of what we actually enable and what language we want to use.
And did you guys, when you guys started the company, were you like, I want to go raise capital, and then I want to go build it? Like, walk me through the sequencing. A lot of founders are always kind of figuring out like, what is the right approach? Do I just sell vision? Like, walk us through that sort of early journey of how did you verify that there was actually a demand for sort of embedded finance products?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that our first company that kind of colored our entire career experience was completely bootstrapped. We were 2 of 4 founders. And so we had spent 10 years building another company without any VC money. And the idea of VC money was quite foreign to us when we started Unit. I mean, of course, we have many friends that started VC-backed companies, but it wasn't a clear, obvious idea to us. Money is a way to finance a business. A business needs to have a demand. I think there was a lot of like futuristic component in our thinking. I mean, obviously back then it wasn't so common to think about embedded finance as something that would clearly branch out of software. So there was a bit of a futuristic thinking. We remember the experience of the first company. One of the things we learned is that we have to execute in a big market. Even if it's speculative, we have to execute in what we believe is going to be a big market. And financial services happen to be, one of the biggest industries on earth. And that felt right to kind of be making that statement about what the future could be. There was definitely a risk. We didn't fully de-risk it, right? It's not like, that companies need cloud security solutions and you're just there to build it and validate it. It was quite kind of futuristic in our thinking. And we can talk about how markets evolve when that's your type of demand that you kind of project 10 years ahead, 5 to 10. Um, it was hard to validate, but there was one interesting form of validation, which is a company called Synapse that no longer exists, was starting to take off. It was clear that people are getting value from using financial primitives, from identifying end users and opening accounts for them and then issuing cards. And this whole idea of Legoing or Lego, block building the financial system was quite interesting to us. And so we looked at what use cases were out there. Most of them were neobanks, right? Not only the Chimes and Venmos, but also a lot of the new gen consumer finance companies that were built on companies like Synapse. We also saw some really interesting examples of people who use that infrastructure to store money and move money. For example, to help real estate funds collect and disperse money back to investors. And so we thought, this idea of creating building blocks for money storage, money movement, and potentially credit had legs. We had to squint and try to imagine what it could be in 10 years. And then we talked to people that built both on the older generation of infrastructure, the Chimes of the world and Mercury back then, and people who built on newer solutions like Synapse. The people who used the newer solutions were not happy with the quality in some cases, but they said, we're not going to make a change immediately. We wish you luck. People that built on old solutions also said, this is not a decision that we can make overnight to move to something like Unit because we have so much sunk cost. But we saw signs that people were thirsty for a better kind of infrastructure. And then we decided to build a V1, not with clear first customers in mind, but with the bet that once we are close enough to launching, we can find them and scale with them. So we can.
But it's like, obviously that decision of like build first, and then, I mean, there's a lot of there's some engineering. You guys both are sort of technical founders. A lot of technical founders out there. It's like, oh, I need to build something and then I'm going to go sell it. I mean, is that, when you look back at that time, was that the right approach? I mean, obviously it's you have APIs, you have web components, but at the same time, like, how do you know you're building it to the way that, let's say, your first customers or the first kind of interested customers would be wanting to engage with the Unit platform?
I think what we set out to build was quite unusual. I mean, if you looked at the infrastructure landscape back then, Marqeta existed purely as a card issuing solution. There were a bunch of compliance and identity solutions that people could cobble into a Marqeta. There were ledgering solutions and money movement solutions and partner banks. And so pitching the idea of Unit would hardly get you a no. Hardly get you a yes when you pitch it to someone, because people can't always square it with the infrastructure that they know. And so what usually happens, and I think Stripe is kind of the same idea, right? If you told people that it would be instant to launch payments with a single line of code back then, the people who lived within the old constructs of payments acceptance would not necessarily think about it as groundbreaking. But Stripe obviously had success over time. And I think we thought about it in the same way. Rippling is another example for a company that kind of broke some norms and bundled more than is reasonable into one system. And so it's hard to get a yes when you change norms. I don't encourage people to launch companies without validation. It's just to make it clear, I have violated every business advice I've given to people in the preceding few years. But I thought, if it's new enough in approach, and if it's not that easy to get a yes as a new infrastructure company, the best you can do is to just build it and then start validating traction. And then, like every early stage founder, you tell yourself, if this doesn't work, I'm going to iterate my way to potential product market fit. Luckily, that ended up attracting companies in the beginning and then scaling. But it was a bet for sure.
And so maybe you can tell me about like your first customer. Like, everyone's trying to find their first customer that would actually like, hey, Unit, you guys obviously have credible background, so maybe they're going to bet on you all as a partner, and it's a greenfield. It's not folks that have used Marqeta and Synapse in a prior life, so they're not thinking about the old frameworks. How did you find your first customer? Did you and What was that relationship like? Because were you still building the plane, or did you actually have components? And they're like, and how did you build how did they have confidence in you all? Because, as you know, you only know so much about what you need to build for those early customers.
Yeah, I mean, it's again in a space that requires trust and requires some proof points that's sensitive. You have to get creative with how you approach first customers. So I violated another principle at Unit, which is we had spent a year building Unit before we launched publicly. We raised money in late 2019. We launched publicly in late 2020, and we spent that year basically compensating or designing thoughtfully for what we thought was going to be a healthy.
So just to make sure I understand, you didn't have any like committed customers at that time when you were building. Okay.
We wanted to, right? We built a network, and we built enough feedback from people out there to have strong opinions on the design of the system and have strong opinions on the type of content that we might want to lead with and the type of messaging. But it was purely a kind of lab exercise in order to set ourselves up for success at launch. I don't want to say academic, but it was definitely kind of building with some calculated bets on what the market was going to accept. And so in that year, 2020, we kind of spent time first on building what we called an unreasonably wide system, in the sense that identity and security and ledgers and card issuing and money movement were all built into this one operating system. And again, this is the rippling kind of narrative violation of, we are not actually going to send our customers to buy 5 or 6 different solutions. We want to come with something more opinionated that helps them go faster. So that's one. The second thing we did is we hired and contracted with people that have brought in critical compliance and legal experience. Doron and I had both built fintech for many years, but we had no idea how to approach the banking space. And it was very important for us to get the right knowledge and systems in place. For example, how do you ingest a dispute from an end user that has a debit card and might want to dispute a transaction? Like, how do you even go about doing it in a compliant way? And the third thing we did was we had to secure critical partnerships, namely with banks. So banks installed Unit as their operating system before we could even get a first customer live. So we had to do all these things in parallel, and that's why we spent 2020 kind of more in building mode and more in minimalistic team mode. And then towards the end of the year, once we had staff and hired our first engineers and compliance people, we were getting ready to launch the website. It was in August of 2020. We also raised our A at that point before we even had a live website, because we made enough progress towards a working system. And then this company, this VC, actually Gradient Ventures, contacted me on LinkedIn. I think it was, Victoria, the partner, had known about us probably from other people in the ecosystem. And she said that she has a portfolio company called Benepass that wants to launch something that might actually be a good fit for us. She made the introduction, and that was, it took us 12 days to give them sandbox access. We built the sandbox and completed the features as we got ready to hand them the keys. And then 12 days later, it was in September, I sent them a handcrafted email that had their sandbox, email and password and instructions and endpoints, and they started building. And we got lucky with that customer. Today, they're a company that just raised Series B, great investors, great team. They serve a lot of public companies. But back then, I think it was, they had an open enrollment timeline to meet, because they're in the benefit space, and what they wanted to build with us was an HSA product. So they had this December timeline, and all they cared about was getting it right and doing it quite quickly. The second thing is they had a very, very technical DNA, so they appreciated the design and the simple approach to building with units. And then you can never put aside the founder-to-founder relationship, right? The fact that we got on calls with them, we took deep notes of their questions, and we gave them a white glove service. And that's what got us to eventually launching with them.
By the way, Benepass does not seem like an obvious early first customer. Based off what you described, that would not be what I was thinking. Did you kind of did you have dozens of other opportunities, and you're like, this is the best one because of what what you've built? Like, how did you approach that? Because, I could ask at that, that time, you're like, hey, what if they didn't have a successful launch? I mean, in this case, it sounds like things moved in the right direction, but what if the Benepass didn't have any growth behind them at that time? Obviously, they're successful now. It could have really changed the dynamic for you all, because you'd be like, hey, do people want this?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you do need to think in planting as many seeds as you can as an early stage founder. That the shape of that use case sounds quite different because it's benefit, but mechanically an HSA account or a high health savings account is actually a checking account. And so we needed to speak their language, but from a regulatory construct, they built something that was very much in line with what we built. They also did not need to identify employers at the time. They needed to identify the employees. So it was easy for us to square a V1 of unit that only supports identity checks for individuals with their use case. And it seemed quite of a fit for what we were building. We can talk about it later, but I do see the risk in overfitting the system to specific use cases. We always want to stay in the business of Legos, and you always have to ask yourself, am I building a piece of Lego that no other company would use or that few other companies would use? And so back then it was easy to square what they needed with what we had. But we also started building relationships with other companies, and we needed to make sure that people know about us, because again, the act of building credibility was a slow act, and it required social proof. It required some buzz in the ecosystem where people would actually know what's being offered. And on the heels of Synapse, the company that I mentioned, and some of the early disappointment of some of their customers, we could get a better NPS to travel across the ecosystem. I should mention that Benepass is a YC company, and their work with Unit is actually what got us a lot of the early excitement in the YC community that later propelled us to more scale.
And in that first, you raise a Series A, Benepass, first customer. How did you approach the sequencing? I mean, there's a lot to make sure this first customer is successful. Were you like, okay, let's just go land a bunch more? Or how did you kind of think about the sequencing and how aggressive you wanted to be in that early go-to-market, especially for an embedded company where just because they build it doesn't mean it's all going to work out and it's going to be perfect? I mean, and as you know, I'm curious, did Benepass just turn it on for everybody, or did they have this sort of careful rollout strategy that was kind of gated in some shape or form? How do they go about it, and what was your advice in that context?
So they were a baby company back then, right? The product that they built with Unit was an expansion into health savings accounts, but it wasn't even the main thing that they enable. They're a benefits company, so they allow people to spend on behalf of the employer. They needed us for something specific that was quite adjacent, and over time they expanded with us. I think as a founder, and this is advice for other founders, you should try to work with as many customers as possible in parallel, because as long as you don't feel that it compromises your long-term success. I'll give you an extreme example, right? Shopify is a company that can let you and me and 50 other companies sign up in parallel to open a store. They don't need to form an opinion about whether Somrat's store succeeds or my store succeeds. If 5% or 10% or 50% of the stores succeed, they end up serving successful stores. This is an extreme easy example because with Unit, you have onboarding resources, you have bank capacity, you have oversight and compliance that you need to enforce. So I would say, I always thought about Unit as a system of bottlenecks. Every company is a system of bottlenecks. You want to make sure as a founder that you remove as many bottlenecks as possible so that your machine can create really high output. We did not have a good reason to stagger or to slow down onboarding of other customers at the time. Today, we have products that are a lot more hands-on, right? The opportunity cost in under-investing in a large customer today of a specific type of unit might actually be quite large. So we're trying to be thoughtful about it. But when your entire business is Legos, you want to allow as many people as possible to buy the Legos and create their own Lego creation and go to market with it.
You had to sort of, maybe it was just the strategy of spending a year in kind of stealth and building as many Legos as possible. But I mean, there are some customers that are way more demanding and may need new types of Legos
Yes.
versus other customers that are happy with the Lego pieces that you offer. Like, obviously, I mean, I appreciate what you're saying about, hey, try to have as many customers conversations, but it's also just like, how did you go about prioritizing kind of like, Benepass startup, YC ecosystem? Maybe there's other sort of YC ecosystems, sort of opportunities, but like, did you just kind of take as much as opportunities you can, and then we're like, hey, let's just push the R&D team to go build as many Lego pieces as possible? Or like, how did you guys think about that? Or were there certain types of customers you just said no to?
Uh, Definitely, we said no to some customers. As an extreme example, we never touched consumer credit, right? So if a company came to us and said we want to launch a credit card for consumers, we would immediately turn down the business. I think about the question you just asked as one of the timeless questions in startup and product management, which is, I'm facing a large market. My product is lacking by definition. How do I say yes to the right opportunities, and how do I allow them to thoughtfully shape my roadmap as opposed to letting them, you know, destroy my product and force me into something that I don't want to build or that might not be useful to others? I'll say two things. One is the job of great infrastructure product teams is to identify actual useful Legos that would not force you to build a new type of solution every time, right? So, as an example, I mean, I'm going to give you a simple product example. When we calculate interest, we allow companies to specify if they want to pay 2% interest or 1% interest on the account. And that allows them to take the Lego and configure it. But we don't have to build for company A and company B. They can just take the Lego and configure it to do what's useful to them. So designing the right building blocks and designing them in a way that's actually reusable and broadly applicable is the job of great infrastructure builders. So I don't have a timeless set of answers, but I think everyone needs to think about it when they're building something that could be applicable to many companies. And the second thing is we also have a system that might be useful to people. We call it the green, yellow, red coloring of features. So if I'm selling to you, let's say that I'm serving Benepass, and Somrat comes to me from a certain enterprise, maybe Gusto, and tells me what they need. Some of the things you're going to say are going to be things that I have. That's the green bucket. That's take the Lego and run with it. We don't need to do anything new. The second bucket is going to be stuff that you say that you need. For example, I want the product to allow me to set limits for different kinds of people. And then we go, oh, that's something we had planned for 6 or 9 months from now. But because Somrat says it's important, maybe we bring it forward and we make it basically more imminent in the product. So I'm not destroying my product. I'm not twisting my product. I'm just bringing forward something that I thought might happen in 9 months. And then there's stuff that is really not a fit, and companies would make a mistake choosing to implement it. For example, if you came to me and said, I want to build a crazy benefits, like a new types of benefit solution, and I don't have the tech resources, can you build it for me at Unit? Our answer is going to be no. I don't see how it serves us now. I don't see how it serves us in a year. And you are too alone in needing it that it would make a good idea for Unit to build it natively into the platform. So I encourage people to bucket features and understand what people are asking them to do.
So, I mean, I can imagine at this time, I know when we were chatting about this, you have this sort of concept of, not like everybody's thinking about building embedded fintech products. Like maybe the opportunity is large in terms of the number of platforms that could build, fintech products as adjacent solutions to drive LTV and so forth. But like, how did you go about saying you need something now? Like, I know you talked about this concept of deciders and explorers. Like, can you elaborate on how you prioritized who really needed something? Because I'm sure you could go to a lot of platforms and said, hey, there's an opportunity for you to go build sort of fintech solutions for your customers. But, as you know, they're all busy and so forth. Like, how did you go about deciding, or more importantly, how did you create demand in the market? And was it all push, 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 or did it kind of ever shift from push to pull? Because when I talk to other embedded fintech founders, it's hard out there, right? It's like, in some ways, all embedded fintech companies are kind of competing for some sort of mind share, which I do want to get to because I know you have this sort of perspective on embedded everything, which we'll talk about next.
Look, it could be true to embedded businesses, but I think it's true to any new market. You just have to accept that if you're building something that doesn't exist yet, the market is going to be at times very educated. In the case of 1% of people who want to buy what you have, at times it's going to be somewhat educated, maybe people that are exploring what you have to offer. And then there's a large swath of the market that's uneducated. We call them unaware. So when we think about the buyers out there, in year 1, 2, 3, any year at Unit, we think about those deciders who know that they want something that Unit can solve, and they're likely going to come to us or we can find them. Then you have the explorers. If the deciders are 1%, the explorers are like 9% of the market. Together they add up to 10. But the explorers is a large group of people that say, can I get an ROI analysis, return on investment, that would help me quantify the opportunity in fintech? I would like to compare it to an AI investment that my CEO really wants me to invest in. And so they are exploring. They want to understand the cost and the benefit, and they will be gravitating. They will be turning into deciders if they feel that it's a good idea. And then you have 90% that we call unawares, and you have to be patient and plant the seeds. But by definition, 90% of the market when Unit started was in an unaware situation. Our approach was always, we need to really excel when we face a decider, right? We can't waste sales and we can't lose when there's a cohort of companies that are actually making buying decisions. We have to shine.
Well, how do you know? First of all, I love the word decider because in some ways there's some clarity on an outcome. But let's be honest, like folks are like saying they're deciding and then they punt another quarter or they punt another 2 quarters. How do you assess whether there's really a decider? If this account is really a decider type of an account.
I think it's pretty timeless in sales that you face those dynamics, and you think you face someone who is ready to make a decision and then they're kicking the can. There are 2 things, right? One is be patient, because you're building relationships and you are participating in learning and teaching that will eventually get you the business. Hopefully it doesn't kill your company, that the demand gets further and further. But if it doesn't, you are earning relationships and you're earning learning. The second thing I would say is that, and this is a big mistake we made at Unit, is that we took the kicking the can as a sign that they're not ready. But our product could have actually been way better and way easier to choose. And that motivated us to create another set of implementation options that allow companies to plug and play and to test demand more quickly. So in other words, when you hear not now once, okay. When you hear not now 50 times, you have to ask yourself, is my product at the shape that allows people to actually say yes? Or does it always seem like too much investment and too speculative? And then, we need to do something about the product that solves for that.
What did you all end up doing to sort of make it easier? And how did you validate that it actually kind of worked in market?
Okay, so there's this idea in business that a lot of early markets have this shape that the people who buy first are the most enthusiastic and early adopting by nature, right? So when the iPhone came out, the people in your life that got the iPhone first were people who were the most, gadget loving. And that's the nature of new markets and new inventions. As you go deeper into the mass market, there are more groups of people like pragmatists, conservatives, and eventually the people who are the latest to the party. I think what we've realized, and this is a very, very important part in our journey, is that, the Bene Passes and a lot of the early companies, the early 100 companies we sold to, were actually companies that had the resources, that had the motivation, and that felt comfortable building with the Legos. But what it takes to sell into the mass market is a very different product motion and go-to-market motion. If you don't get the product insight, no amount of go-to-market would help. So when you asked me, how do you pitch to people that they should buy embedded finance? I will tell you, you have to have something that actually makes it easier for them to engage and say yes. Not all of them, but at least a reasonable amount of them. So the first thing we did was, we looked at the product that we had that was more building block based, API based, and we kind of, I call this, sold people airplanes and taught them how to fly the airplanes, and how to make a good fintech program embedded in their product. We took a very different approach with the pragmatists, the people who work at the next 500 companies. We told them, you might want to fly the airplane one day, but we actually have an airline that we can operate for you. And that airline can be something that you choose to put passengers on, and you can just sell the tickets. So you can send people into an embedded finance area in your product, but unit builds and unit manages this experience down to the customer support and the limits and the fraud. And that's a very different way to present the product because it allows them to think more in plug and play. We also launched Capital, which allows them to offer capital without offering banking and without offering any money movement, straight up, to people's Chase accounts and Wells Fargo accounts. And that really helped us, I think about the next set of buyers.
How the question I have, so one makes sense. You're selling to kind of smaller companies. I'm not saying small but in terms of their reach, but I can only imagine and is that some of these customers of yours are not pushing their fintech solutions. And how did you think about that? Because in some ways, the business of an infrastructure solution is kind of a little bit kind of tied to how well do your customers sell their own products and how their own growth. And I can imagine, now you raise a Series A, there's probably some increasing pressure to say, what are your numbers? Grow, but you don't have complete control over the end outcome. I mean, maybe there was some sort of rocket ships there and then, right place, right time. But, how do you control that sort of outcome for you yourselves?
Well, this is the classic double activation problem, right? That exists in embedded finance or in any embedded product, which is it's not only selling to someone, it's encouraging them to sell and drive adoption among their customers, which is a very hard problem. And I think for any embedded founder out there, I would say that this is something that can kill your company. If you don't consider the capital implication of this journey, if you underestimate how hard and how slow it would be to get adoption and get volume, you might actually overspend. So I spoke to a lot of people who are building embedded solutions in the last 3 years, and this is my first advice to them. Think seriously about the capital equation and don't think that you can be, a company that always raises the next round at growth. Even if you bring logos, you have to drive activation within the customer base of those customers that you signed. So that remains an important problem for us. Historically, we've seen companies that are, I call these the people who bought the airplane and fly high, the people who bought the airplane and never took off, or those that took off and then landed. We've seen companies grappling with the adoption question. For some of them, it's very easy. For some of them, it's harder. We've seen patterns, and I can talk about them.
Yeah, like what I mean, because a lot of embedded founders, any infrastructure solution has a sort of double activation kind of challenge. Like, is there any kind of sort of rules of thumb you would probably share with others to say, hey, if I were, because then going back to the decider narrative, right? Going, hey, how do we know that they're not just going to build it? They're actually going to care about the end execution and the performance of the products that they build, right? You can have the best solution. Doesn't mean they're going to adopt it.
My first advice is leave a lot of margin for error. Don't kill your company assuming that every logo you sign is going to materialize fully. That's just not going to happen. The patterns, try to identify the patterns that indicate that someone is about to be more or less successful. I'll give an example. Companies that use Unit as mission critical money infrastructure, like Benepass that I mentioned, they're much more likely to use you because they're integrating the accounts into the onboarding flow of employees, right? So when employees get benefits from their employers, the account opening is kind of weaved into the onboarding flow at Benepass. It's kind of invisible to the employee. And when we act as a critical piece of infrastructure as opposed to a nice to have, that always indicates that the account might be more committed and easier to retain and grow. Another pattern is companies that have money flow going through them. So Wix is a good example. They help hundreds of thousands of businesses process payments and sell services and goods online. And they pay out to a Chase account or a Citi account, but they have the ability to create a built-in money hub within Wix quite easily. They need to construct the experience and they need to reroute payments so that they go into this money hub. So we look for signs of either us being critical infrastructure that enables something important in the business, or if it's adjacent, we look for conditions for success. And of course, you care that the leadership at the company you're selling into cares and commits. And so that's kind of the selection and pattern recognition. I can
Did
talk
you
about
did you ever sell to sort of companies that you kind of knew? Like, would you ever say, "Hey, I don't think you really need us," or you're like, "Hey, I don't really think this is the right time for what you?" It sounds like did you ever say no to folks, and or did you ever close someone knowing I don't really know where this is going to go, but we're doing it for some other reason?
We say no to folks for a lot of reasons, right? One could be a commercial reason where we don't see legs. It could be a consumer neobank in 2026 would never excite us. So we allow them to find other solutions in the market. We have signed companies knowing that there is some speculation about whether they can be successful. And they wanted to take the swing and we committed to helping them. And we've seen a lot of people entering it with the best intentions and never taking off, or taking off and then deciding that it's not for them. We've seen companies operating embedded finance and scale and then saying, you know what, we are paying out to hourly workers. We don't actually feel that this is better than Venmo, even though it's at some level of scale. We are deciding to withdraw from this space. I think what's most important is actually the product. Like, I think if you design your product to make it simpler to launch and simpler to succeed with minimal brain damage, that's the key to scaling and sustaining. And there's going to be a bunch of shots that don't hit the goal, and that's fine. That's part of building infrastructure.
Well, hey, Itai, coming to this conversation, there were actually like a lot of things I wanted to chat about. We were talking about pricing, we're talking about packaging, we're talking about different types of people you can sell to, the technical buyer and so forth. It feels like we need more time to go even further, because I think this is an area that a lot of founders are kind of struggling with. I did want to kind of leave with some questions I have for you around, like, if you went back in time, right, say, 2019, 2020, and you had to go to do some certain things differently, founders starting companies right now, maybe building fintech solutions, maybe infrastructure solutions, or just building, an AI SaaS company. Like, what would you do differently based off of your learnings now that you're kind of 6-7 years in? Obviously, as a founder, you've sort of 20 plus years in.
Be mindful of the chasm. The gap I mentioned between your early adopters and the mass market is a place where many, many companies die or just become niche businesses that never scale. And you need to face some signs that there is a different type of buyer on the horizon, starting 2023, but we haven't taken full action until late 2024. So I would say that be very mindful of how your first 5% of your customers are going to be very, very different from the next 95%. We have acted on the product and go-to-market motions that require that we need to act on to capture the mass market, but we could have done it sooner. And I think the same is true to AI businesses today, where there's probably a bunch of tech-savvy people that will pick up your product. But if you sell to restaurants, for example, the tech-savvy restaurant owners pool is relatively small. And there's going to be a point in time where you need to lean into more old school techniques like salespeople and mail offers to restaurants and foot traffic. And that's something that I would encourage people not to avoid. Embrace the messier problems that would help you unlock more. I give the example of Amazon and logistics, right? If Amazon didn't crack logistics, it would not have been the company that it is today. But embrace something that looks messy, because if it's going to help you become the company that you want to be, that's something you should take seriously.
Well, absolutely love that. I feel we probably could spend another hour, and we probably should find more time because I do think there's a lot more to talk about here. But I do appreciate you taking time. I know you're a busy person and you have hundreds of customers to serve, and a lot of founders want to learn based off the experiences. So thank you for sharing some insights, and we're gonna have to do this again because you and I didn't cover all the topics that we thought we would cover today.
Thanks for inviting me. Glad to share.
Hey, this is Ben Kesnoka, co-founder of Village Global. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Village Global podcast, where we go deep on all of the biggest topics in tech. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can check us out on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love to see you for the next one.